Hi, my name is Kelsey Hollien. I'm a graduate student at the University of Arizona, and I'm also this year's SIP fellow at Saguaro National Park, where I worked on a project called Wildlife and Climate Change in High Elevation Springs in Saguaro National Park. So Saguaro is pretty unique. It's got two different districts that are kind of separated by Tucson. So the Tucson Mountain District in the west and the Rincon Mountain District in the east. So the Rincon Mountain District contains the Rincon Mountains, which span from about 3,000 feet at the valley floor to almost 9,000 feet at the top. And this is where all the high elevation spring work is located. So at the higher elevations, there have been a number of historic springs that have been really stable in the past, but due to climate change-induced drought as well as sedimentation from recent wildfires, many of these are now dry. However, since 2017, dozens of new springs have been discovered, and these new springs now need to be studied in order to determine any kind of need for management strategies, whether they should remain as refuges for wildlife or whether they can be used for human use as well, so hikers and backpackers. So study these springs, there are a couple different things that we do. So we first do a spring assessment. So we describe the stability as well as the water level, the vegetation, any other kind of defining site characteristics. And then we also deploy camera traps. So we have photo cameras, which are still motion activated, but they capture still photos, as well as vegetation time lapses. And then we have video cameras that capture the wildlife behavior. And so the project is still in its early stages. Most of this work was hiking to and from trail cameras. So we were based out of Manning Camp, which is a historic cabin up on the mountain. And between all of these springs, we covered about 230 miles within 5 weeks. So it's very much still a boots on the ground kind of preliminary study. But we do have 10 springs that we focused on during this time. And between those 10 springs, we had 24 cameras out. And so we had paired photo and video cameras at each spring, so one of each. And then these cameras are also still out, so the data, again, is still preliminary. They'll probably still be out until September or October. So this is kind of the data that we have to date. So what we do have is a good idea of who is visiting the springs the most so far. So again, the cameras are still out and they'll be checked periodically until September or October, kind of depending on the weather. But so far, in the 3 months that they have been out, we've gotten about 6,000 records, so total number of photos or videos. And then we've also detected 19 species, as well as figured out kind of who the main players are about who uses these springs the most. So white-tailed deer lead the pack by quite a large margin, followed by black bear, who have the highest detection frequency at these springs. And so we do have a lot of good footage. So this is kind of the meat of the project. So now I'm going to show a short highlights video with some of the most representative clips. The white-tailed deer are the most common visitors to these springs. They often hang around drinking and browsing. They visit frequently enough that antler growth can often be tracked in the males. And then black bear are also frequent visitors. They often are the culprits for many of our downed cameras. However, documenting a mama bear and cubs is always really good data. Mountain lions have so far been more elusive. They haven't been documented drinking water in any of these springs this year, only moving through. So you may be more likely to see them on the trails than at the cameras. And this is a coati. It's a southwestern species related to raccoons that are widespread in Mexico, but aren't quite as common here. And then ringtails are another elusive relative of the raccoon. They are on occasion observed hanging out with striped skunks. Bobcats are also infrequently seen, but unlike mountain lions, they've been visiting several of our springs a handful of occasions to drink. And then cotton-tailed rabbits are one of the fairly common small mammals that we see at the springs, but we don't always get to see this kind of courtship behavior. So we have observed a lot of interesting animal behaviors, one of which is bear wallowing, which is basically just when a bear will sit or lie down in a spring and have a roll around. So prior to the season, it was noted that many of these springs were conspicuously bear-shaped. So it was really validating to observe that this behavior was actually occurring. This is the first time documenting this, but it was hypothesized that this wallowing could actually be a really helpful way to keep water at the surface. And so this is something that we could continue to monitor in the future, particularly at these springs where they've been detected, as well as particularly during the dry seasons. So other interesting observations were the use of these springs by the Mexican spotted owls. So this is an endangered species in the park that they've been studying for a couple of years now, doing mostly call point surveys, but catching them on video has been another really great way to kind of keep track of them. So last year there were some young fledglings that were actually seen at one of the springs, which is something that wouldn't really have been seen doing the usual owl survey. So it's really nice to have extra observations on species like this. So another component of this project was tracking hydro period, which is just the time that part of the spring was wet. So wildlife use these springs different based on the hydro period. So the year started off very dry, but we got 13 inches of rain up on the mountain just in July alone. So it went from very dry, very hot, to being very wet very quickly. And so detection rates were actually much higher earlier in the summer than they were right now, because water is basically so abundant at this point that there's no need for these animals to visit the springs as much anymore. So there's not that concentration of animals there at the springs. So what I did was I generated these hydrographs that track hydro period by estimating each time we visited a spring what percentage of the spring expression that could hold surface water was currently holding surface water. So these hydrographs basically just provide a visual reference for the hydro period, changes over how they change over season, and it can also be scaled up to show changes over years as the project moves forward. So again, some of these were very stable to begin with. They didn't change much over the course of the season, but some of them were also very variable, going from very dry to 100% full almost overnight with the arrival of the rains. So these springs are still relatively new, and so there's just going to be a lot of continuing research, specifically revolving around the use of the wildlife cameras. We're also going to begin collecting hydrologic data on the surface water at the springs, so that's going to include measurements such as surface area, depth, and volume of the surface water, as well as using the time-lapse photography to track vegetation growth through the season, as well as track any of the changes in the hydro period as well. So thank you for attending. I had a really great time this summer. Big special thanks to everyone at Saguaro, specifically Nicole Gonzalez, my supervisor, and everyone else on the resource staff, and Jessica Johnson and the rest of the SIP program as well for this opportunity. Thank you.